Welcome to Strategy Talk, where the editors of Strategy Page discuss current events with a splash of history. I'm Dan Masterson, host of Strategy Talk. With me today is the editor of Strategy Page, well-known military author and game designer Jim Dunnigan. Also joining us is the associate editor of Strategy Page, columnist and author Austin Bay.
Welcome, Austin and Jim. Jim, how real is the nuclear threat from Russia to nuke the Ukrainians?
Well, that's the problem. Nobody knows. And that's what Putin is counting on. Nothing like a little uncertainty to weaken his enemies. But the history of, nuclear blackmail is relatively new. And I doubt if anybody's going to give into it. Now, that doesn't mean he might not try something involving nuclear material. He's also talked about a dirty bomb, which is simply normal explosive coated with nuclear materials that spreads the material around and basically contaminates a fairly large area for a long time. And it's expensive to clean up. So, that could be, his threat. But actually using nuclear weapons, it's unlikely. I mean, we've threatened already that retribution would be swift and widespread. And what we may have been referring to, nobody's confirmed this, was more than 20 years ago. U.S. Air Force proposed a solution to that called SSBS, Simultaneous Strategic Bombing Strike, which then involved the relatively new, widespread availability of GPS-guided bombs, and in cooperation with some troops put on the ground to acquire, more precise locations of targets. This would definitely put a dent in the Russian, nuclear response. And I'm not talking strategic, so to speak, but we're talking, locally. Russia's a big place, and SBS on that scale is basically impractical. Maybe Putin is depending on that, but I doubt very much if he's intent on ordering a strategic nuclear strike, because that would basically result in the end of Russia. And a lot of Russians know that. In fact, the problem Putin is having is he bet his career, as it were, on rapid conquest of Ukraine. He had all this propaganda about there's really no Ukrainians, they're Russians who were led astray by NATO and blind Western influences, et cetera, et cetera. This simply increased the resolve of the Ukrainians. Now, Putin, since he hasn't got soldiers, as it were, reliable enough or effective enough to basically stop the Ukrainian offensive, which started, 3 months ago, and basically shows every possibility of overrunning all the Russian occupied territory in Ukraine and expelling the Russians. Now, Putin, swears that he will not give up. He will simply, redouble his efforts, but his support inside of Russia is rapidly eroding. And he realizes that if he ultimately does lose, he's now, committed what the UN is calling war crimes. His attacks on Ukrainian civilians and civilian infrastructure. That is definitely a no-no. And that is all on him because he ordered it. So, he probably would not be able to order a nuclear strike because it's alienated too many senior people in the government as well as the military. And he sees that, support he does have eroding day by day. So I think it's past the point where he could take a chance and get away with it. But, he's the loose wheel, so to speak, in this whole, machinery of keeping the nuclear peace, as it were.
Austin, so what about the loose wheel?
Let me take it from a different tack, Dan. A slightly different tack. Putin's been desperate since about 3 weeks into the war. I think he was, it took him that long to realize that his special operation had really flopped in the first 24 to 48 hours of the invasion. Special operation. Heck, it was a strike really at Kiev to try to force Zelensky to flee or kill him, and then he was counting on what now is clearly politically corrupted, if not monetarily corrupted intelligence that said that the Ukrainians wanted to be Russians. Just take a look at the nation in arms. They anything but. Many of the Russians speakers, ethnic Russians who live in Ukraine, didn't want to have anything to do with a Russia run by Vladimir Putin and the oligarchs. So the one thing, and here's to get back to nukes, the one advantage in a war of attrition that has resulted, even though in the last, Jim, 6 to 8 weeks, we've seen a war of maneuver on the part of the Ukrainians, a war of calculated maneuver, is he's got nukes. The irony there is Ukraine traded in its nukes in 1994 with that Budapest Accord, and for an absolute ironclad guarantee of its territorial integrity from the Kremlin. And that was supposedly backed up by the United States and the United Kingdom. Well, you can see how ironclad that agreement was. When you have a dictator motivated by really a golden age dream of Russian imperialism, as one of his latest statements. And again, this will lead back to nukes. Is he says, "Our ideology is Russian victory." Well, now that is so tribal. It's been done before. You can peel a lot of things that German Nazis and Italian fascists said in the 1930s that essentially say the same thing. So Putin's another nationalist socialist is what he amounts to. But he does have the nukes. Ukraine doesn't. Ukraine's not part of NATO. NATO Article 5 says that you violate the geographic borders of a NATO nation, you're at war with every other member of NATO. And several members of NATO, France, Great Britain, the United States, have nuclear weapons. So there's a nuclear umbrella over NATO nations. That's at least at the political, diplomatic, let's call it the perceptual level. You've got nuke on nuke. Now, is one nuke a very bad day? It's a very dangerous day. Quick sidebar, Jim and I have talked about this before, but even in the 1970s, United States had very small yield nuclear weapons that really didn't leave much radiation. Much. They were tactical, delivered by tube artillery pieces or short range ballistic missiles. Much cleaner than what the Russians had in terms of the radiation signature. Theoretically, they could be used, and without a massive radiation hazard. But you use anything larger, and I'm talking, and also dirtier. I know what U.S. and British weapons were like as they evolved through the 70s and 80s. It was to where there was a less, again, we're talking about very small yield nuclear weapons, less of a radiation hazard. Those might be usable without Armageddon. The deal is the perception and here I'm making a big statement, but every day I read through statements from NATO headquarters, but also NATO nations, is that every single one of them, with a perhaps Erdogan's Turkey being the exception, but I say perhaps, say that, believe the war in Ukraine, that Ukraine is fighting a war for the rest of Europe to stop a malevolent, malign, and expansionist dictatorship. And they've got a good job of doing it. And as Jim's already talked about, the dictator, Putin, he's he really is in a very, very desperate situation. More and more talk all the time of oligarchs moving against him, of the military moving against him, because he has hurt Russia. Now, they've damaged Ukrainian infrastructure, however how many billions it takes to rebuild it, but they haven't gained anything. They've lost an army. So what's he got? The choice is that, well, one of the first things I saw somebody discussing, and I don't know if it came from the Kremlin, is that there was going to be a demonstration nuke set off somewhere over the Black Sea. It's bad. Black Sea basin. That's going to tick off Turkey, Georgia, Bulgaria, Romania, as well as Ukraine. And 3 of those nations are NATO nations. So I say that's off the table. And then there was going to be a dirty bomb that the Ukrainians were going to set off that would justify Russian tactical nuclear strikes. Okay. But then that sets off, it puts a marker down, and you are in a position, Russia's put in a position where a justified counterstrike by NATO? Yes, I believe so. And I think that's the calculation in the Kremlin as well. That has to be delivered in the same way that Trump told Kim Jong-un, do you want condos or craters? You can't have both. And I'm paraphrasing what President Trump said, but speaking with clarity is you've got an opportunity to cooperate, but if you go nuclear, you're dead. You don't have condos, you have craters. Which gets back to where Jim opened up with the simultaneous strategic bombing strike. We've improved on that because the initial essay Jim had on the Upload Strategy page dates from 2001, I think. And it was describing it using JDAMs as Joint Direct Attack Munitions. And missiles and support, and primarily relying on delivery by U.S. Air Force strategic bombers. Well, always in the concept there was including cruise missiles, and I can speak from a scenario that I worked with in Office of Strategic Assessment, even intermediate range ballistic missiles carrying conventional warheads or multiple conventional warheads and the like. And you're trying to time it so all of the rounds, all of the bombs, all of the munitions arrive, as Jim said, on targeted areas at the same time. For the reason that you catch them by surprise, you did. If you don't decapitate, and I'm talking really about striking military targets, it's an attempt to decapitate the military's long-range strike capability, not their strategic nuclear weapons, but like strategic bombers and major depots, arms and munitions depots. What it is taking the Army's tactical concept, tactical/operational, of time on target up to a strategic level. Time on target was developed by a bunch of Army majors and captains at Fort Sill in the late 20s and early 30s, and essentially it was taking advantage of the radio to connect all the tube artillery pieces that were within range of a particular target. They also had elaborate firing tables. Remember, they did this with analog devices and slide rules and manual calculation to figure out how the firing sequence so that all the rounds of up to, let's say, 10 battalions, that's 180 guns, land on a target at once. And you get not only the firepower, explosive power, but you get a seismic shock as well. And that refined and started using it successfully in I think late 42, but definitely 43 in Italy, which is where it picked up the name time on target. The same concept is implicit. The central concept is implicit in simultaneous strategic bombing strike. The working it out in a specific operation, though, requires cruise missiles and all the other missiles coming in, and you want enough standoff so that your munitions don't commit fratricide, much less your munitions knock down manned platforms. The addition of drones and loitering munitions make the concept more credible. But you've got to have great intelligence, and you've got to have, again, practiced it so that you can execute it. The result is nuclear effects using conventional munitions. And even though I've been a bit long-winded about it, this is what the Russian military needs to know from NATO, from the U.S. military, as well as you guys do this. This is something you could face without us using nuclear weapons. Question is, do we do it? We have no treaty commitment to Ukraine. We have a monetary and moral commitment at this point, but we don't have a treaty commitment. That said, the use of a nuclear weapon in Europe, even on Russian soil, well, that is another possibility. Putin setting off a nuclear device inside Russia. He's already destroying Russia. I guess that might be the final straw for the oligarchs of the armies setting off a nuclear weapon in Russian territory. But avoid it. Avoid doing it. Don't go there. And the recommendation would be that Russia get into serious negotiations with Ukraine about how Russia is going to withdraw from occupied territories.
Jim, does the Russian military have the will to follow Putin's order to launch nuclear weapons?
Well, he thought he did, and I think early on he did, but his support in the military has been rapidly declining. And I suspect at this point, I mean, again, judging from the Russian media, which we have access to, obviously, the enthusiasm, as it were, the willingness to continue this war is rapidly, declining. And this is basically making Putin nervous because he realizes that if he hits the point of no return, which is rapidly approaching in Ukraine, he's dead, literally. If he's out of power, he's a wanted war criminal. And as Austin pointed out, Russia's economy has taken severe damage. And the only way they can basically recover from that is to get free of the sanctions and be free to basically rebuild their economy. They can't do that by themselves. They have no allies other than, say, Iran, which is similar to Russia, but they haven't got their nukes yet. Meanwhile, North Korea had earlier said they've got a new policy. They won't wait to be attacked with nuclear weapons. They'll use their nuclear weapons first if they think they're in danger of having a massive attack, whether it's conventional or whatever. But Kim Jong-un, in the third generation of the Kim dynasty, is also worried about surviving, because again, North Korea is rapidly declining economically. He's put a lot of the money that he could have used for the public welfare into nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles, and it's really unclear if he has a useful, strategic nuclear weapon yet, because the tests they've conducted so far have not really produced how should I put it, a usable, strategic weapon, and he hasn't, as far as anyone can tell, engineered any of the existing nukes to reliably work inside a ballistic missile. He hasn't tested that yet. If he has, and if he tests it, and it fails, he's in big trouble, because then we know the emperor is indeed naked. He has no clothes. So you've basically got two, desperate. Well, the Iranians make it three, because the Iranians are facing nationwide, demonstrations been going on for 7 weeks now, with no sign of abating, and they are asking for the overthrow of the religious dictatorship that's ruled Iran since the 1980s, and a lot of Iranians are calling for the end of Islam in Iran, because it's basically nothing but harm to the country. So we're facing a crisis on three fronts, and I think Putin has basically maneuvered himself into the weakest position of the three, followed by Iran, and of course North Korea. They're very fanatical, but they may just starve themselves to death, because it's reached a point where even the military isn't getting enough, food, and you get drafted for at least 6 years in North Korea, and a lot of these guys, they thought, well, if I stay in the army, don't try and run away or whatever, at least I'll have 3 meals a day. Well, now they're getting 2, maybe 1 meal. So you can run this racket, so to speak, only for so long before you run out of capabilities and run out of options. And the gamble is, will Putin have enough, clout, as it were, within the military to actually use a nuke, before his, how should I put it, his power declines below the threshold of control. And, foreign assessments are that, he is already beyond, below that threshold, and he's now scrambling for some way to intimidate, Ukraine and the West into just giving him what he wants, without resorting to nukes. And that's not going to work, because, again, the new NATO countries, the ones that joined after 1991, especially Poland, they remember centuries of Russian aggression. And the whole point for joining NATO was to protect themselves against Russia. Russia has been, the primary reason for NATO in the first place, keeping the Russians out during the Cold War, and now keeping the Russians from trying to, reconquer Ukraine. Of course, they have their eyes, the maps they've shown indicate, large portions of Poland would be reintegrated into the Russian Empire. That's not going to happen. The Russians don't want it. They're willing to pay the price. They've already been exposed to how expensive it can be. I mean, the economy is a mess. Unemployment is skyrocketing. Inflation is going up. It's basically on a death spiral. And as Austin points out, a lot of the oligarchs, the wealthiest Russians, and a lot of senior military people realize that this is a death trip if they keep it up. So I think we'll see the finale of this, definitely before the end of the year, because by then the Ukrainians, by the way, the Ukrainian military advantage is that in the beginning they used basically the militia, the volunteers, equipped with NATO anti-tank weapons, which nobody realized how effective they were against Russian tanks, which had a serious flaw in their design with their autoloader. It made them all, basically vulnerable. Any hit in the turret blew the whole thing up. So they didn't just have damaged tanks. They had lost tanks, and the 3-man crew was gone with it. And the Russian soldiers, quickly picked up on that. And they said, oh, my God, this is suicide. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians have been training troops. And when they started their offensive, their troops were trained, disciplined. They were well equipped. Sure, they were using Russian tanks, but the Russians still didn't have top attack, ATGMs, missiles, to take advantage of the flaw in the Russian designed tanks. Also, the Ukrainians are aware of the fact that you can somewhat mitigate that flaw by modifying the use of the autoloader to keep the amount of ammunition in the turret, available for an explosion to a minimum. But anyway, because they were better trained and better organized and better led and better motivated, they've just been running, the Russians out, and I think Putin realizes that he has no army anymore. He cannot resist. I mean, he can't even defend Russia, with the damage that's been done. I mean, they've admitted, the Ukrainians have claimed, and their claims tend out to be true. They've lost, about 96,000 dead. And this news eventually got back to all the Russians, despite the Russian media being state controlled, saying otherwise. And so many Russians, Russian families, have a son or a brother, whatever, husband in this case with the mobilization, who didn't come back, was mobilized, sent off to Ukraine with no training, very little equipment and what have you, because Russia is out of that stuff and just getting killed. And there have been videos appearing recently of Russian troops, basically one of their guys standing up and saying to a large number of fellow conscripts or mobilization troops, these are older guys, that they're just using us for cannon fodder. We're just here to get killed. And then you hear all these guys cheering. So I doubt if that was just some sort of fabrication to lull the West into a state of confidence, because on the battlefield the Ukrainians are proving it. There's just nothing that can stop them. And I think the Russians, let's face it, they for a while they went along with Putin because he was the boss and he had the power to basically imprison or murder, and he hasn't got that much power anymore. He can issue orders and they just aren't followed. So there we go. So it should be over by the end of the year, and if there's going to be any nuclear danger, it'll start dissipating rapidly, in the next few weeks. That's our prediction.
Austin, do you have anything to add to close this out?
I'd go with that. There was one other thing that I thought might be worth mentioning is flip it around and you're in the Russian military and Putin tells you to hit a target in Ukraine. What target do you choose? If you are really going to do it, what do you target? Do you target Kharkov, Kiev? I'm using Russian names for them. Do you really target them? And especially when you know that Kharkov is a substantial number of ethnic Russians live there. Are you going to do that? Are you going to put it near the Polish border? What happens if you miss the Polish border and actually hit, the Ukraine, and hit inside Poland? Now you're at war with NATO. That has something that a responsible military organization, military command would turn around and tell Vlad, hey, listen, what is it do you want us to hit? And with how large? Dan, that's another reason I don't think they're going to do it. They just want to use, Putin just wants the intimidation factor of it. It puts them in a huge bind because they're going to kill a lot. They've already killed a lot of Russians, but if they use a nuke or nukes, they're going to end up killing a lot more Russians, and possibly there are scenarios for it. The dissolution of Russia as we currently know it. So I think they'll stay away from it. I would say, Jim, I see Putin trying to hang on into spring of next year, but winter's an enemy for everybody in Russia and Ukraine. So it may be the time that the Russian army just calls the war off because of the suffering that's going to occur, at least in the field, during the winter.
Well, that's one last thing to mention. The Ukrainians are prepared for winter warfare. What would slow them down would be the mud season, or Batista, which occurs in the spring. That hurt the Russians during the initial invasion. Once the ground turned to mud, which it does for a few weeks or a month, nobody has much mobility. But during the cold weather, and it's cold, but it's not as as bad down in Ukraine because it's closer to the the Black Sea.
Right.
They have the clothing, they have the experience, they have the trained troops. They will take advantage of the cold weather. So yeah, Putin might try to hang on to the spring and hope the Rapatista saved them as it did, during World War II. But this isn't World War II, and they're playing the Nazis. So
look, I'm aware of all the cold weather equipment that NATO nations have been sending to Ukraine. I mean, started reading about it 3 months ago. So that I think they have, let's say, a thermal advantage. I'll just come up with that. A thermal advantage the Ukrainians do because, all right, we'll get ready. And again, this is based on media, but also I've seen a lot, and through the British press mostly, of interviews with the captured Russians, and they don't even have basic summer equipment. It's much less winter. I'll just leave it at that because that it's going to be hard on them. It's going to be hard.
Okay, we'll talk to you gentlemen next time.
take
Bye.
care.
Bye.